Okay, so this is my desk or my table, and I actually have two giant tables here, and as you can see, I'm working on a big painting. This is actually a full sheet of watercolor, and I've been experimenting with rocks. And what I want to talk about today is the beautiful colors that I got in my rocks, this warm kind of apricot tone. And actually I usually say apricot, so I don't know who I was trying to impress there. Anyhow, this really beautiful tone of color, which I've actually used the same red in here, and I've also dropped it in over here to create a warmer gray shadow. I'm not sure if you can even see that. And I want to talk about that color because I just learned about it. I've been having fun playing with it. It's amazing. And so we're just gonna pull some paper out and just do some little fiddling around. And I've got a little different camera angle today. Tripod's in use somewhere else, and so we're just going to make do with what we have in the studio. Ever since I moved my studio out of the house, I am still having trouble figuring out what stuff needs to be in the studio and what stuff I keep here at home. So here's a piece of scrap paper. And in fact, I'm just going to rip this right in half. Of course, if you want a nice straight line, that's where you get a ruler. Again, excuse the slightly different angle. We'll just work with what we have. So I found with Daniel Smith watercolor, they tend to stay a little moister in the palette a lot of times, at least for a while. So that means it's pretty easy to get a lot of pigment on your brush in a hurry. And I've got Venetian Red in my palette right here, so I'm just gonna use that. And this palette here is actually just full of colors that I had bought and hadn't really taken the time to experiment with. So I threw them in my palette so I know that if they're nearby, I'll at least try them. And there's several here that I am using now on a regular basis, and others I still need to experiment with yet. The more you get to know a color, the easier it is to figure out how to use it in different applications in your painting. So Venetian Red initially I had stayed kind of away from because I tend to not paint with a lot of earth tones. And at first glance it looks kind of orangey and kind of opaque. It doesn't have as much transparency as I usually expect from my paints. And kind of just a bit of a muddiness to it. And I was finding that I tend to go for colors that are very transparent. So this color that seemed a little muddy to me just wasn't appealing. And then I was reading an article by Thomas Schaller about his favorite colors, and this has a permanent place in his palette. And he uses a limited palette of, I think, about 8 colors. So he really doesn't use a lot of colors, and yet this is one that he's chosen to not be without. So, and then he was talking about he likes colors that are sedimentary, that have little particles that fall into the bumps in your paper, and or sit on the top, and they mix differently than colors that aren't sedimentary. And the sedimentary thing got to me because I love that too. One of my favorite paints to use is, just the more sedimentary they are, the more I like them. They tend to just separate differently when you're painting and create these really interesting effects. And so I really do love those colors. So I started trying Venetian Red, and I actually learned that I really like it. And I want to show you one of the reasons that I love it. If I were to wet my paper down right here, I'm going to just drop in, first of all, a little bit of this quinacridone coral. And I want to show you what it does when I put a stroke on this wet wash. Pretty much stays in one place. Do you see that? Of course it's going to be fuzzy around the edges, but it doesn't take over the whole page. It doesn't bleed out. Now if I take Venetian Red, look at how it moves on the paper. I don't know if there's a term for this. When you look at a tube of watercolor paint, they're rated, they have light fastness, and often just the different grades and so forth. Some you can find a chart that tells you whether they're sedimentary and how transparent they are, but I haven't found a term for how they move when they're in water. And I love this. I call it flow. So I love these colors that are high flow, because what happens is, and I'm running out of paper here, what happens is you take a color that has a high amount of flow and you add it to another wash of color. And I'm gonna just, let's see, we'll pick something here. Pick a green maybe. Why not? So I'm gonna pick some green gold and I'm just gonna throw that over here. And I'm also gonna pick a dark color because green gold's pretty bright. So I'm gonna pick a dark color. I'm gonna pick Windsor Violet. Put some of that over here. And what happens is colors with a great amount of flow, if you drop them into a wet wash where color is already existing or where water is, they're going to push whatever's already wet on the paper. So I lay this down, and dioxazine violet, Windsor Violet, is a high flow color itself. And it starts to move even though there's already color there, and in fact it will even take a darker color and push that darker color away. So it's a lot of fun to start throwing those colors around and know that when I add a high flow color like this Venetian Red, it's actually going to take over even a darker color and start to push it across the page. And depending on how wet your paper or your paint wash is, it's going to do different things. And so that's a really amazing, just a fun thing to work with, because generally we talk about working light to dark, and yet if you have a high flow color like Venetian Red, another one is Nicolezo Yellow, which is another favorite of mine right here, also from Daniel Smith, and it's also high flow. And so as soon as you drop that in, even if you've got a really dark wash, that Nicolezo Yellow will take over and, oh, there it is. Try to find a little bit of it here. And we'll push other colors around. So they're a little bit bossy, but it's so, look at how that just comes in. Even though it's violet underneath, it just kind of comes in and wants to just take over and push those other colors away and move. And so really fun to add, to drop in bright color into a dark wash and know it's going to do something and not just get buried underneath that dark color. So really a great reason to love those high flow colors, and it was the very first thing that made me fall in love with Venetian Red. Now the other thing about Venetian Red is, look at this. This is that lighter wash I did at the very beginning. I had dark Venetian Red here and I pulled it down to lighten it with clear water. And now it's softened. It just doesn't have that muddy oranginess that I was that kind of had turned me off to this color. It's so soft. It's this kind of pinky peach that would be wonderful for skin tones actually. And it just has a real softness. And in that rock painting I showed you at the very beginning, we saw how that really warmed up the rock without being too bright and yellowy. It's not too harsh. And a lot of oranges, you'll find they're very harsh and bright and strong, even when you tone them down. This one's Peril Orange, Peril Orange from Daniel Smith. And you can see it's a lot purer. This one has a lot more of muted tone, and it's just very easy to work with because it is so subdued. And so another reason that I'm kind of falling in love with Venetian Red. Now let's see what Venetian Red does when we mix it with other colors. Okay, this is not actually watercolor paper. This is a chunk of mat board, but we're just mixing color, so we're not going to waste it. All we need is a white background so we can mix our color. So let's take Venetian Red, and you know me, I like to mix my color right on the paper. So we'll just take it here, and let's add some yellow to it. And I'm going to use this Aureolin over here. And just see how it looks with the color that's close to it on the color wheel. And again, Aureolin doesn't tend to move a lot, so the Venetian Red kind of wants to take over and flow. But we're just getting a kind of a nice orange. And the best way to really see what a color is going to do is just to pull it out with some clear water. And the reason I like to mix right on the paper is what you see right here. There's a real beautiful smoothness. It's not as smooth as if you mixed it here. It's got this flow. There's a little hints of more yellow here and a little more orange here, and so it's just a little more natural and a little more dynamic. I think dynamic is one of my favorite words to describe watercolor, because so much can happen when you're letting things happen on the page like this. Now on the other side of red on the color wheel is blue. So let's mix it with some blue, and I'm going to put the blue down first for a change. This is cobalt blue. And it's a pretty natural blue. And pretty transparent, as you can see. So we'll put down the Verditer Red, and Verditer Red's a little bit orangey, so they're verging on being complements to each other, so they're going to muddy each other up a little bit. And you can see it flowing in there. It's making kind of a subdued violet. And I really try not to touch my washes too much when I start adding color on the page. Let them do their own blending. And you can see I'm getting kind of a murky violet, which I kind of like. And if I were to actually mix, you can see it gets, yeah, it's a pretty reddish violet. Add a little more blue to make it a little more of a bluish violet. And that would be really actually kind of a gray violet, which would be nice for storm clouds. I like that. The other thing I should mention, staining and non-staining, is Verditer or Venetian Red a staining color. Best way to find out for sure is just to dab it on your paper and then lift and see how much comes off. And you can see it does stain a little. Let's see, wet it down a little bit. I think it doesn't, yeah. It's pretty non-staining, so it really just sits on the surface. And most sedimentary colors, that's what they're going to do. You know, the reason they're sedimentary is because they don't soak in, they settle on the surface and sit there. Okay, Venetian Red, and let's add some green. And I've got Prussian Green, which is kind of a blue-green, which I think would be really nice because an orangey red has a bit of yellow in it. So we're kind of covering the whole color spectrum there. This is Prussian Green. And they don't really want to mingle. You can see they're not naturally flowing into each other, which is interesting. And then so let's just let that happen. Pull some of that color down. And of course we're going to get a neutral of some kind. And so we just move it around until it's really starting to mix. And on this side it's going to be more on the green side, and on this side it's going to be more on the red side. And yeah, it's kind of a nice cloudy brown, and I really like the muted. Every one of these has a very muted feel, so if you're wanting to go with a more muted palette, you don't want that bright saturation like you get from that Pyrrole Orange, then you know Venetian Red is a great option for you. And as much as I love pure colors, there really is a place in your watercolor for those moments of calm, that soft, smooth color, those gentle color transitions that you get with the kind of that cloudier color. So Venetian Red, I'm a big fan. Looking forward to using it more. And I want to thank Thomas Schaller for mentioning it in his article about the colors he uses, because I actually had it on hand and it really opened my eyes to its possibilities. And again, just look at these colors. I don't know if you're close enough to see, but just no color is simple here. The sedimentary colors do this. They mingle, but they don't ever truly belong together. And so you get this beautiful and amazing transition that's very complex, and again has that dynamic essence that really is just so fun to create in watercolor. And it's one of the reasons I love watercolor. You don't see that with other paints, and so I encourage you, explore your colors and see what you've got there in your palette and how they interact together, and then try something new. And that's Venetian Red from Daniel Smith. The other color I mentioned today was Nicolezo Yellow, and Pyrrole Orange is this bright orange one. And so give those a try. This green was Prussian Green, Aureolin, which is also from Daniel Smith, and Cobalt Blue. And all great colors, and you can just see how much fun it is to mix them and see what they do together.